Hey guys, we discussed in past videos Greek, Egypt mythology, but tonight we're going all the way back to the beginning of Norse mythology, before Asgard, Odin, before there was even a world to stand on, and we're going to build it up piece by piece the way the old Norse stories actually tell it. But before we jump into mythology, take a minute to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now, wherever you are. I love seeing this community stretch across time zones while we drift through someone else's ancient night together. All right, lights down, get cozy, and let's ease into it. Before there was a world, there was nothing shaped enough to be called a world at all. The people who told these stories lived along fjords and farmsteads across Scandinavia in the centuries around the Viking Age, roughly 790 to 1100 CE. They did not write their beliefs down. They spoke them, sang them, carried them from one winter fire to the next, and what survives of them today. Then there was Thor, and Thor was the god people actually liked having around. Where Odin was calculating and a little unsettling, Thor was straightforward, enormously strong, quick to anger and quicker to forgive, and the protector ordinary farmers and sailors turned to when something needed smashing. His hammer, Mjolnir, was short-handled because a scheming Loki had interrupted the dwarves forging it, but it never mattered, since Thor could put a giant down with one throw and have the hammer fly right back into his hand. He spent an enormous amount of his mythology traveling into Jotunheim to fight giants, sometimes for revenge, sometimes because a giant had stolen something of his, most famously his own hammer, which meant Thor once had to dress up as a bride to steal it back, beard and all, in one of the more openly comic stories in the whole tradition. He was the sky god they blamed for thunder and thanked for good weather, and archaeological evidence suggests ordinary Vikings felt closer to him than to almost any other figure in the pantheon. Loki does not fit neatly into either family of gods, and that was rather the point of him. He was technically a giant by blood, brought into Asgard as Odin's own blood brother, and for a long stretch of the mythology he served the gods well, using his cleverness to get them out of trouble he'd often caused in the first place. He talked his way through impossible bargains, shapeshifted into animals when it suited him, and once turned himself into a mare to distract a stallion, later giving birth to Odin's 8-legged horse as a result. But Loki's schemes curdled over time. His children by a giantess, the wolf Fenrir, the serpent Jormungandr, and the goddess Hel were feared enough by the gods that they were bound, cast into the sea, or exiled to the underworld before they'd even had the chance to do anything. And eventually Loki's mischief tipped into something the gods couldn't forgive, engineering the death of the best loved of them all, a betrayal that turned him from trickster to enemy for good. Frigg, Odin's wife, is remembered as the queen of Asgard and as a figure of quiet, prophetic knowledge, said to know the fate of every being in the 9 realms, even though she rarely spoke it aloud. Freyja, by contrast, came from the Vanir, brought to Asgard as part of the peace settlement after the war between the two divine families, and she carried love, beauty, war, and death all at once, riding into battle to claim half of the fallen for her own hall, Folkvanga, while Odin claimed the other half for Valhalla. She practiced a form of magic called Saya, which she is said to have taught to Odin himself, and she owned a necklace, Brisingamen, so beautiful that the story of how she acquired it became its own scandal. Her twin brother Freyr ruled over fertility and prosperity, sailed a ship called Skidbladnir that could be folded up small enough to fit in a pocket, and famously fell so hopelessly in love with a giantess that he traded away his own magic sword just to win her, a bargain that would matter a great deal later when Ragnarok finally arrived and he had nothing left to fight Surtar with. Tyr gets remembered for one story more than any other, and it's a story about sacrifice. When the gods decided the wolf Fenrir had grown too dangerous to leave loose, they needed to bind him, and Fenrir, no fool, would only accept the binding if one of the gods placed a hand in his mouth as a show of good faith. Tyr was the only one willing to do it. The binding held. Fenrir bit down. Tyr lost the hand and kept his reputation, forever after, as the god of courage and of law, the one who paid the price so the rest of Asgard didn't have to. And then there was Balder, the most loved of all the gods, beautiful and gentle by every account, so cherished that his mother Frigg travelled through all 9 realms extracting a promise from every single thing that existed: fire, water, iron, stone, every disease, every animal, that none of them would ever harm her son. She overlooked one plant. Mistletoe seemed too small and too harmless to bother asking. It was that oversight, exploited by Loki, that would end Balder's life and, in a very real sense, start the countdown to the end of the world. Beyond the gods themselves, Norse mythology filled its 9 realms with creatures built less to be worshipped than to be feared, and feared for a reason, since most of them were prophesied to be the ones who'd eventually kill the gods. Fenrir the wolf grew so fast and so large that the gods bound him with a magical ribbon forged by dwarves out of impossible things: the sound of a cat's footsteps, a woman's beard, a mountain's roots, thin as silk and unbreakable all the same. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, grew so long that Odin threw him into the ocean surrounding the human world, where he grew large enough to circle the entire earth and grip his own tail in his teeth, a boundary marker for Midgard as much as a monster. Hel, their sister, was given rule over the realm of the same name, the destination for anyone who died of sickness or old age rather than in battle, and she is described as half a living woman and half a rotting corpse, ruling her cold hall with a grim, absolute authority. Sleipnir, Odin's own horse, stood apart from these darker offspring, an 8-legged grey stallion fast enough to gallop between the realms of the living and the dead, born, strangely, from Loki's own shape-shifting rather than from any union meant to threaten the gods. The Valkyries served Odin directly, riding out over battlefields to choose which of the slain deserved a place in Valhalla, their name literally meaning choosers of the slain. And the Norns, the 3 sisters at the base of Yggdrasil, outranked gods and giants alike, since it was their spinning, not divine will, that decided how long any life, human or otherwise, actually lasted. The giants, the Jötnar, remain the gods' oldest and most complicated relationship, descended from Ymir himself, cast as enemies in most of the myths and yet married into the family more than once, since Thor's own mother was a giantess and more than one god took a giantess as a wife. And finally, deep underground in Svartalfheim, the dwarves worked, master craftsmen who forged nearly every treasure the gods owned: Thor's hammer, Odin's spear, Freya's folding ship, proof that even the mightiest gods in Asgard still depended on hands smaller and older than their own. One morning Thor woke up and reached for his hammer, and it wasn't there. Mjolnir, the one weapon standing between Asgard and total chaos, had simply vanished, and Thor, in a panic no one had ever seen from him before, went straight to Loki for help. It didn't take long to find the culprit. A giant named Thrym had stolen the hammer and buried it 8 miles underground, and he would only give it back on one condition. Freyja had to marry him. Freyja refused so violently that the halls of Asgard shook, so the gods came up with a different plan entirely. Thor himself would dress as the bride. He was draped in a wedding gown, veiled, decked out in Freyja's own necklace, and sent off to Jotunheim with Loki disguised beside him as a handmaid, improvising excuses every time Thrym noticed something off about his enormous, ravenous bride. When the hammer was finally brought out to bless the marriage, as custom demanded, Thor grabbed it and got the answer he'd been waiting for the whole meal. Not every trip to Jotunheim went Thor's way. Travelling with Loki once into giant territory, Thor was challenged to a series of contests by a giant king named Utgarda-Loki and lost every single one. He couldn't finish a drinking horn that seemed bottomless. He couldn't lift a house cat off the floor. He couldn't even pin an old woman in a wrestling match. It was only afterward, once they'd left the giant's hall, that Utgarda-Loki admitted the whole thing had been illusion. The horn had been connected to the ocean itself, and Thor had drunk enough to visibly lower the tides. The cat had been Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, disguised, and lifting even one paw off the ground had been an almost impossible feat of strength. The old woman had been old age itself, a match nothing alive can win. Thor had, in fact, come astonishingly close to breaking the world and hadn't even known it. Thor's most direct confrontation with that same serpent came on a fishing trip. Disguised as a giant himself, Thor went out on a boat with the giant Hymir, using an ox's head as bait, and cast his line straight down into the deep. What took the hook was Jormungandr, and the fight that followed shook the boat so hard that Thor's feet went straight through the hull. He hauled the serpent's head up out of the water, hammer raised for the killing blow, and in most versions of the story it was Hymir, terrified, who cut the line before Thor could finish it, sending the serpent back down into the ocean to wait for a rematch that wouldn't come until Ragnarok. Odin's own hunger for wisdom produced some of the strangest stories in the whole mythology, and the mead of poetry is the strangest of all. The mead itself was brewed from the blood of a being named Kvasir, created from the spit of two warring divine families as a symbol of their peace, and murdered by two dwarves who mixed his blood with honey to make a drink that granted anyone who tasted it the gift of poetry. The mead passed through several increasingly violent hands before ending up guarded inside a mountain by a giant named Suttung. Odin wanted it. He drilled his way into the mountain, seduced the giant's daughter into letting him drink all 3 vats in 3 swallows, then transformed himself into an eagle and fled with Suttung in hot pursuit, also as an eagle, spitting the mead out into vessels waiting back in Asgard just before he was caught. A few drops fell outside the walls during the chase, and the Norse explained bad poets by pointing to those spilled, wasted drops. Odin's other great quest for knowledge cost him more directly. He hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights, wounded by his own spear, taking nothing to eat or drink, until the runes revealed themselves out of the dark below him, a self-inflicted ordeal that gave the gods writing itself. Idun, keeper of the golden apples that kept every god young, was once tricked out of Asgard entirely by Loki, lured into a forest and snatched up by a giant named Thiazi in eagle form. Without her apples, the gods began to age immediately, growing grey and stooped within days, and they knew exactly who to blame. Loki, under threat, transformed into a falcon, flew to the giant's hall, turned Idun into a nut, and carried her home with Thiazi in furious pursuit, a chase the gods ended by lighting a bonfire at the walls of Asgard that caught the giant's wings as he flew over and burned him out of the sky. Not every giant in these stories came as an enemy. One arrived offering to build a wall around Asgard strong enough to keep every threat out, asking in payment for the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freyja herself if he could finish the job in a single winter. The gods agreed, certain no one could work that fast, until the giant stallion turned out to have supernatural strength and the wall neared completion with days to spare. Panicked, the gods turned on Loki, whose idea the whole bargain had been, and Loki solved the problem by turning himself into a mare and luring the stallion away, delaying the work just long enough for the deadline to pass. Loki, in his mare form, later gave birth to Sleipnir as a result, which meant the god responsible for the crisis walked away from it with a new 8-legged horse for Odin. Fenrir's binding is one of the darker stories, precisely because the gods knew they were being cruel and did it anyway. Having raised the wolf pup in Asgard, they watched him grow at a terrifying rate, and prophecy told them exactly what he'd eventually do. 2 ordinary chains failed to hold him, so the dwarves forged a third, a ribbon made of impossible things, thin enough to slip through a hand. Fenrir agreed to be bound only if a god placed a hand in his mouth as good faith that this wasn't another trick. Tyr volunteered. The ribbon held. Fenrir, realizing he'd been deceived, bit down, and Tyr lost his hand for it, a debt the wolf would remember all the way to Ragnarok. Baldur's death is the hinge the entire mythology turns on. Frigg's effort to make her son invulnerable had covered nearly everything in the 9 realms, everything except mistletoe, which she judged too small to bother asking. Loki found that gap. He crafted a dart from mistletoe and handed it to Balder's blind brother, Hutta, who had been left out of the game the other gods were playing, throwing harmless objects at Balder for sport since none of them could hurt him. Loki guided Hutta's aim. The dart struck true, and Balder fell dead in front of the entire assembly of gods. Even then, there was one last chance to reverse it. Hel agreed to release Balder from her realm if every single thing in existence would weep for him, and nearly everything did, until a giantess sitting alone in a cave refused, dry-eyed, and the deal collapsed. That giantess, it turned out later, had been Loki in disguise. His punishment, once the gods worked out what he'd done, was the last story of this stretch. Loki was hunted down, bound to 3 rocks with the entrails of his own son, and a serpent was set above his face to drip venom onto him without end. His wife Sigyn stayed beside him, catching the venom in a bowl, but every time she had to empty it, the poison struck him directly, and his convulsions, the Norse said, were the true cause of earthquakes. He would stay bound there, screaming beneath the dripping venom until the ropes finally gave way at Ragnarok. With the gods' own stories told, it's worth stepping back to what all of this meant for the people actually listening to them. Ordinary humans in Midgard, descended from Ask and Embla, and living out short, uncertain lives under a sky that was, quite literally, the inside of a dead giant's skull. Death was not a single destination in this worldview. Where you ended up depended almost entirely on how you died. Warriors who fell bravely in battle had a chance at Valhalla, Odin's own hall, chosen there by his Valkyries, and gathered specifically to keep training and feasting in preparation for the war still coming at the end of the world, the Einherjar, fighting each other to the death every day only to heal completely by evening and start again. Half of the battle dead, though, never made it to Odin at all. They went instead to Folkvanga, Freyja's own field, a second warrior's hall that existed alongside Valhalla rather than beneath it, since Freyja claimed her share of the fallen just as Odin claimed his. Everyone else, the people who died of sickness, old age, or simple bad luck rather than glory, went down to Hel, the cold underground realm ruled by the goddess of the same name. This wasn't punishment in the way later religious traditions would understand it. Hell was not a place of torment built to correct sinners. It was simply where most people went, a quiet, dim continuation of existence rather than a reward or a penalty. And that distinction matters, because it means the Norse afterlife never worked as a clean heaven versus hell divide. Where you ended up said less about how good a person you'd been and more about the manner of your death. A reflection of a warrior culture that prized how you met your end over almost anything else you'd done while alive. Fate sat above the gods in this worldview, not below them. Most mythologies put their gods in charge of destiny. The Norse didn't. At the base of Yggdrasil, drawing water from the well of Erd, 3 sisters called the Norns spun out the length and shape of every life in the 9 realms, human and divine alike, and nobody, not Odin, not Thor, not any of them, could unwind what the Norns had already spun. The Old Norse had a word for this. Word. Something closer to an unfolding pattern than a fixed script, but the effect was the same either way. Odin, wisest of all the gods, spent an enormous amount of his existence hunting down knowledge specifically because he wanted to know his own fate, and what he found out did not comfort him. He knew he would die at Ragnarok. He knew how. He knew who would kill him. And he built Valhalla anyway, gathered his warriors anyway, prepared for a battle he already knew he was going to lose. That's the strange, almost tragic core running underneath the whole Norse cosmos. Even the gods lived inside a story whose ending they couldn't rewrite, and they chose to spend their remaining time getting ready for it rather than pretending it wasn't coming. The signs of Ragnarok, when they finally started, were impossible to mistake. It began with Fimbulwinter, 3 consecutive winters with no summers between them, cold and dark, stacking on top of cold and dark until the world itself seemed to be losing hope. The sources describe society collapsing under the strain of it, Brothers turning on brothers, family bonds breaking down entirely, a complete unraveling of the decency that had held human communities together, as if the coming end of the world was already poisoning the one that still existed. Then the bonds broke, one after another. Fenrir, chained since the day Tyr lost his hand, finally snapped free. Jormungandr, coiled around Midgard for the entire span of the world's existence, rose up out of the ocean, thrashing violently enough to flood the land. Loki, bound to his rocks with his son's entrails and dripping with venom for longer than anyone could measure, broke loose as well, and with him came every force of chaos the gods had spent the whole mythology trying to contain: giants, monsters, the dead themselves sailing in on a ship built from their own fingernails. Watching all of this from Asgard, the gods didn't panic. They'd known this was coming for as long as any of them could remember, so they gathered, prepared their weapons, and called every warrior feasting in Valhalla to arm for the last time. Heimdall, the watchman who could see and hear for enormous distances, sounded the horn Jalahorn, and that sound was the actual starting bell for the battle, the signal that there was no more waiting left to do. What followed was less a battle than a series of duels, each one settling an old score the mythology had been building toward the entire time. Odin rode out against Fenrir, the wolf he'd feared and imprisoned for a lifetime, and lost. Fenrir killed him outright, swallowing him whole, and it was Odin's own son Vidar who avenged his father, tearing the wolf's jaws apart with a single reinforced boot in a killing built entirely around patient, quiet vengeance. Thor found Jormungandr at last, the serpent he'd hooked once on a fishing trip and lost, and this time neither of them let go. Thor crushed the serpent's skull, ending a rivalry that had spanned the whole of the world's existence. But the serpent's venom had already done its work, and Thor staggered only 9 steps away before collapsing dead himself. Freyr faced Surtar, the fire giant who'd existed since before the world was even built, and lost badly, undone by his own decision, made ages earlier, to trade away his magic sword for the love of a giantess, leaving him to fight the most dangerous being in the 9 realms with nothing but improvised weapons. And Heimdall, the watchman who'd sounded the horn that started it all, met Loki in one final confrontation, and the two of them killed each other, ending a rivalry the sources suggest went back even further than most of the others. By the time the fighting was over, most of the gods who'd shaped this entire mythology were dead. Asgard itself lay in ruins, and Surtur, the last force still standing, swept fire across the whole of creation, a blaze that consumed Yggdrasil down to its trembling roots and burned away everything that had existed since Ymir's body first became the world. For a moment, there was nothing again, the same kind of nothing that had existed before Ginnungagap. The old world sank beneath the waves, gone entirely, and there was silence where an entire cosmos had just been standing. But the Norse never told this as a story that simply ended. Following the same cyclical logic that had shaped everything from the beginning, a new earth rose back up out of the sea, green and fertile, untouched by the fire that had destroyed the one before it. 2 human beings, Leif and Leifaracia, had survived the entire catastrophe by hiding inside the wood of Yggdrasil itself, sheltered through the fire in the one place it apparently couldn't reach, and they emerged to become the ancestors of a second humanity, exactly the way Ask and Embla had once become the ancestors of the first. The gods, too, had survivors. Balder, murdered so long before by his own blind brother, returned from Hel's realm along with Hutta. The two of them reconciled in a way the poem's original quarrel had never allowed while the old world still stood. Vidar and Vali, Odin's sons, lived on. Thor's own sons, Magni and Modi, inherited their father's hammer and, presumably, his temper, ready to carry forward whatever needed carrying. This new generation gathered on the grass where Asgard had once stood, and the sources describe them finding golden game pieces left behind in that grass, relics of the old god's leisure, a small, strange detail that suggests the new world wasn't meant to forget the one that came before it entirely. Even the sun continued, after a fashion. Before Fenrir swallowed her, the old sun goddess had given birth to a daughter just as radiant as she was, and it was this daughter who rose to light the new sky, carrying on a cycle that had never really been about a single ending at all. The world had been built once, from a giant's corpse, destroyed once, in fire and flood, and reborn once more, quieter and smaller but recognizably continuing, which was, in the end, the entire point of telling it this way. Ragnarok was never the finale. It was just the hinge the story turned on. The moment where an old world had to burn completely before a new one could rise up out of the same sea that had shaped everything from the very beginning. One of the most famous names to come out of the whole Viking age, Ragnar Lothbrok, a man who might have been a real Danish raider, might have been 3 or 4 different Viking leaders folded into one, and might, in places, be almost entirely made up. We're going to tell the story the way the old sagas tell it, and along the way we're going to keep being honest about where the legend stops and the history starts. The name itself is really 2 names stitched together. Ragnar, most likely meaning something like warrior or army council, and Lothbrok, which translates roughly to hairy breeches or shaggy trousers, a nickname the sagas say he earned from an unusual set of protective clothing he wore into one particular fight, a story we'll get to. By the time medieval writers were putting his story on parchment, centuries after he supposedly lived, that name had become one of the most famous in Scandinavian storytelling, attached to sons who conquered kingdoms and to a death so vivid it got repeated for 800 years afterward. The trouble is that almost nothing about Ragnar comes to us directly. He appears first in fragments, a name mentioned in passing by Frankish monks recording a raid, a name half remembered in Icelandic poetry composed generations after his supposed death, and only much later stitched into something resembling a full biography by saga writers working in the 13th century, 3.5 centuries removed from the events they were describing. Identifying which parts of that biography, if any, describe one real man is one of the genuinely open questions in Viking Age history, and it's a question we'll be circling back to throughout this whole series. The world Ragnar was supposedly born into was 9th century Scandinavia, a patchwork of Danish and Swedish petty kingdoms without the kind of centralized rule later European nations would take for granted. Power belonged to whichever chieftain or king could hold the loyalty of enough warriors and enough ships, and ships were everything. Viking longships were fast, shallow drafted, capable of crossing open ocean, and just as capable of sliding up a river to strike somewhere no one expected an attack from the sea. Scandinavian life at the time was a mix of farming, trading, and raiding, often within the same family and sometimes within the same year, and the wealth pouring out of Western Europe made the choice between those activities an easy one for an ambitious man. Monasteries sat undefended and stuffed with silver. Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, wealthy from trade and agriculture, had nothing like the coordinated coastal defense needed to stop a fleet that could appear and vanish within days. It's not hard to see why a young man from this world, hungry for more than an ordinary farmstead, might have looked south and west and seen opportunity. According to the legendary sagas, Ragnar's own bloodline was already exceptional before he did anything himself. The tale of Ragnar Lodbrok and related Icelandic sources trace his father back to Sigurd Ring, said to have ruled as a king in Sweden, or in some tellings Denmark, and beyond Sigurd, the genealogy reaches back through several more generations of legendary kings, eventually claiming descent from the god Odin himself, a detail that tells us less about Ragnar's actual ancestry and more about how badly later storytellers wanted to elevate him. The sagas describe his childhood only in the broadest strokes, a big, striking, capable boy trained early in the skills a Viking leader would need: weapons, seamanship, the ability to hold the loyalty of other men. What actually happened in Ragnar's early years, assuming a real Ragnar existed at all, is simply not something any surviving source can tell us with confidence. The stories jump almost immediately from birth to legend, skipping the ordinary texture of a real childhood entirely, which is itself a signal of how much of this account belongs to the realm of storytelling rather than record-keeping. That gap between legend and evidence only widens once Ragnar starts, according to the sagas, building himself into a leader. The Icelandic accounts describe his rise less as a single event and more as a steady accumulation of reputation. One daring raid or one impressive feat convincing more warriors to follow him, more ships joining his fleet, until he commanded the kind of force capable of threatening kingdoms rather than just villages. This is the shape almost every Viking leader's rise takes in the sagas, since the genre itself is built around escalating displays of courage, attracting escalating numbers of followers, and it's worth remembering that we have no independent record confirming any of this happened to a specific man named Ragnar in this specific order. What we do know from actual Frankish and Anglo-Saxon sources is that a Viking leader referred to as Ragnar or Reginerus was active and dangerous enough to be named directly by monks recording an attack around 840, which tells us at minimum that someone using a version of this name was operating at exactly the right moment in history to have inspired what came later. Whatever the truth behind any single leader, the mechanics of how a Viking fleet actually came together and fought are much better documented than Ragnar's personal biography. Longships were the foundation of everything, built shallow enough to cross open sea, yet also navigate rivers deep into the heart of a kingdom, fast enough to outrun pursuit and light enough to be hauled overland between waterways when needed. A successful leader needed to recruit and equip warriors, arm them with axes, spears, swords for those wealthy enough to own one, and the round wooden shields that gave Viking formations their wall-like defensive line. Loyalty in this world was transactional as much as it was personal. Warriors followed a leader because that leader could be trusted to bring them home with plunder, and a single failed raid, or a leader who couldn't deliver silver and glory, would see his followers drift towards someone who could. Fleets operated less like a standing army and more like a coalition. Ships and crews assembling around a leader's reputation for a specific campaign and dispersing again once it was over, which meant reputation itself, the kind Ragnar supposedly built raid by raid, functioned as the actual currency of Viking Age power. It's in this stretch of the legend that Ragnar's name gets tied to one of the most famous women in Norse storytelling, the shield maiden Lagertha. According to Saxo Grammaticus, writing in Latin around the year 1200, Ragnar first encountered Lagertha while seeking revenge against a Swedish king who had killed his grandfather, and found in the fighting a woman leading warriors as fiercely as any man present, her hair loose and unmistakable in the middle of the battle. Saxo's account has Ragnar so struck by her that he sought her out afterward and, in a detail that reads uncomfortably today, forced her hand in marriage only after first killing a bear and a great hound she'd set to guard her home. A test meant to prove he was worthy of her rather than simply powerful enough to overwhelm her. Their marriage produced a son, Fridlif, and 2 daughters, according to Saxo, before Ragnar eventually set Lagertha aside for another wife entirely. It's worth being direct about how uncertain all of this is. Lagertha appears in essentially one major source, Saxo's Gesta Danorum, written centuries after any events she's associated with could have occurred, and nothing about her existence is corroborated anywhere else. Whether she reflects a real shield maiden tradition in Viking society, a literary invention of Saxo's own, or some blend of both remains genuinely unresolved among historians, and modern portrayals that treat her as straightforwardly historical are getting ahead of what the evidence actually supports. What she does represent, reliably, is the space Norse storytelling made for women as warriors and rulers in its own legendary imagination, whatever the reality behind any one figure like her turns out to have been. Raiding was the engine that turned an ambitious Viking leader into a legendary one, and the pattern the sagas describe for Ragnar matches what we know of Viking strategy more broadly. Wealthy coastal settlements and undefended monasteries made for easy, extraordinarily profitable targets, since a longship crew could strike a target, load it with silver, and be back at sea before any organized response could reach them. Surprise was the whole point. Viking fleets rarely announced themselves, favouring shallow river mouths and quiet coves that let them appear seemingly out of nowhere, hit hard, and vanish just as fast. Every successful raid did double duty, filling a leader's ships with plunder while also filling his reputation with the kind of fear that made the next raid easier and the next round of recruitment simpler. A Viking leader's political power in this world was measured almost entirely in successful raids behind him, and by the saga's account, Ragnar had an unusually long list of them. Nothing in Ragnar's legendary career comes close to the fame of the Siege of Paris, and here the story sits right at the seam between saga and historical record. In the later Norse tradition, the attack on Paris became one of Ragnar's signature triumphs, described with the kind of scale that turns a raid into an epic, an enormous fleet darkening the Seine, a defending force overwhelmed and unable to mount a coordinated resistance, and Ragnar himself credited in later storytelling as the mastermind who brought the great city to its knees. The historical event those stories are almost certainly drawing from actually happened: the siege and sack of Paris in the year 845. A Viking fleet, described in Frankish chronicles as led by a Norse chieftain named Reginharus, sailed up the Seine, defeated a divided Frankish force sent out to stop them, and famously hanged over 100 captured prisoners on an island in the river as an offering to Odin, a calculated act of terror aimed as much at the defenders still watching from the walls as at the men being executed. King Charles the Bald, unable to dislodge the raiders, ultimately paid an enormous ransom, thousands of pounds of silver and gold, simply to make them leave, sparing the city and its churches from further destruction. Reginharus and his fleet returned to their overlord, the Danish king Horik I, though the Frankish sources go on to note that Reginharus soon died from a violent illness that spread through his men and back home to Denmark as well, a detail some medieval chroniclers were quick to frame as divine punishment for the sacrilege of the raid. Whether this Reginharus and the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok are the same person is one of the most debated identifications in the entire field, and historians remain genuinely split. The timing fits. The name is close enough to be plausible. But the later saga tradition also had every incentive to attach a real, well-documented triumph like the sack of Paris onto its most famous hero, whether or not he'd actually been the one to lead it, and that possibility can't be ruled out either. Whatever the truth of any single raid, it's clear that fear of a leader answering to the name Ragnar, or something very close to it, was spreading across multiple kingdoms by the middle of the 9th century. Frankish monks recorded him by name as an active threat as early as 840. Sources tied to Ireland and the British Isles describe Viking activity from a leader plausibly connected to the same figure through the 850s. And whether one man was truly behind all of it, or the name simply became a magnet for the achievements of several successful Viking leaders, the effect was the same. By the time the historical trail on the real Ragnar, or Reginharus, or whoever he actually was, finally goes cold, sometime in the early to mid-850s, the reputation had already outgrown the man. It was that reputation, more than any single verified fact, that the Icelandic saga writers inherited 3.5 centuries later, and it was that reputation they built into the sprawling, dragon-slaying, kingdom-conquering legend audiences still recognize today. The stories only grew larger after his death, absorbing the deeds of other Viking leaders and folding them into one unforgettable name, which is exactly how legends are made. The saga tradition treats Ragnar's meeting with his third wife as one of the great turning points of his whole story. After the death of his second wife, Thora, the sagas describe Ragnar coming across a woman of extraordinary beauty and unusual wisdom living, of all places, with a poor peasant couple in Norway, going by the name Crackle. Struck by her intelligence as much as her appearance, Ragnar married her, only for the story to reveal its twist later on. Crackle was not a peasant's daughter at all, but Aslog, the secret child of the legendary hero Sigurd, hidden away and raised in humble obscurity to protect her from enemies who would have killed her had her true parentage been known. It's a classic piece of saga storytelling, the hidden noblewoman raised low and revealed high. And it does real narrative work, since it ties Ragnar's bloodline directly into the wider web of Norse heroic legend, connecting his family to one of the most celebrated warriors in the entire tradition. What actually happened, if anything, behind this story is impossible to verify. A slog appears nowhere in the more historically grounded sources. Only in the legendary sagas built generations after any of this could have taken place, which places her firmly in the realm of story rather than record. What made this marriage matter to the saga writers wasn't romance for its own sake. It was the children it produced, since Aslog's sons would go on to become far more historically significant than Ragnar himself. Different medieval sources genuinely disagree about exactly how many sons Ragnar had and by which wife, and it's worth sitting with that disagreement rather than smoothing it over, because it tells us something honest about how these legends were built. The core group most consistently named across the sagas includes Björn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Hvitserk, and Uber, though Saxo Grammaticus's version of the family tree adds and rearranges names, and different Icelandic sources shuffle which sons belong to which mother. Some accounts put Björn and Ivar as sons of Aslog. Others assign different combinations to Thora, and at least one non-marital son, Ube, is described as coming from an entirely separate relationship altogether. Rather than treating any single version as the correct one, it's more accurate to say that medieval audiences inherited multiple, sometimes contradictory family trees for Ragnar, each reflecting whichever regional tradition or storyteller was doing the telling. What's remarkable is that several of these sons, whatever their exact parentage, correspond to genuine, independently attested historical figures. Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, and Halfdan Ragnarsson all appear in sources with no particular reason to be inventing them, which is far more than can be said for their father. As fathers went, in the world the sagas describe, Ragnar held his sons to an exacting standard, expecting each of them to match or exceed his own reputation as a warrior, and the sons, in turn, are portrayed as competing fiercely with one another for their father's approval and for their own claim to fame. This rivalry becomes an explicit plot point in several sagas, sons pushing each other toward greater and more dangerous exploits, each one trying to outdo not just their brothers but the legendary father whose name they all carried. The irony the sagas seem fully aware of, and even lean into, is that this competitive pressure worked exactly as intended and then some. By the time the sons reached adulthood, their own conquests, the invasion of England chief among them, had grown so large and so consequential that Ragnar's own reputation started to look almost modest by comparison. The teacher, in effect, was overtaken by his students, and the saga writers seem to treat this not as a tragedy but as the natural, almost inevitable outcome of raising sons that ambitious. Before any of that family drama, though, the sagas insist on establishing Ragnar's credentials with a story that has nothing to do with raiding kingdoms at all: a dragon. According to the tale of Ragnar Lodbrok and the related Sogubrot, a young Ragnar travelled to the lands of the Geats seeking the hand of Thora, daughter of the Jarl Herau, only to find her guarded by an enormous, venomous serpent, described in some versions as two serpents, coiled around her dwelling and killing anyone who approached. Ragnar's solution was as practical as it was strange. He had special clothing made, thickly hardened and boiled in tar or pitch, protective enough to withstand the serpent's venom and bite, and it was wearing this unusual gear that he went in and killed the beast, winning Thora as his wife in the process. The clothing itself is the whole origin of his nickname. Lodbrok, hairy or shaggy breeches, commemorates exactly this outfit, meaning that one of the most famous names in Viking legend traces back, quite literally, to a set of tar-hardened trousers built to fight a snake. It's a story built for exactly the kind of dramatic, larger-than-life credibility a hero needs before the audience will believe anything else claimed about him. And it worked. The nickname stuck for 800 years. By the time this dragon-slaying reputation had settled onto him, ordinary Viking success in the world the sagas construct simply wasn't enough for Ragnar anymore. Raiding monasteries and coastal towns had made him wealthy and feared, but the stories increasingly frame him as a man measuring himself against kings rather than against other raiders, someone whose ambition kept scaling upward in step with his reputation. This is where the sagas start setting up the collision course that will define the rest of his story. A growing hunger for greater conquests, a refusal to be content with what he already had, and a willingness to provoke rulers far more powerful and far better defended than the isolated monasteries that had made his early fortune. Whether this reflects a real man's genuine ambition or simply the narrative logic of a legend that needs its hero to overreach before it can destroy him is, as with so much of Ragnar's story, impossible to say for certain. What is certain is where that ambition, real or invented, was about to point him next. Across the North Sea, toward England, and toward the king whose name would become permanently linked with his own. England, by the 9th century, was one of the richest targets a Viking fleet could set its sights on. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms carried generations of accumulated wealth in their monasteries, churches, and royal treasuries, wealth that had already drawn Viking raiders across the North Sea for decades before Ragnar's story reaches this point. Crossing that sea was no small undertaking, but by the standards of Viking seafaring, it was a manageable one. And the legendary tradition treats Ragnar's turn toward England less as a practical decision about plunder and more as a matter of pride. His sons, by this point in the saga chronology, were already grown into formidable warriors in their own right, and the stories suggest that Ragnar, watching their reputations start to rival and even threaten to eclipse his own, felt the need to prove he could still do something none of them had managed. That need is exactly what the sagas say drove him toward his final, fatal campaign. Rather than assembling the kind of large, well-supplied fleet that had carried him to victory in the past, Ragnar is said to have set out for England with just 2 ships, a force so small it reads almost like a boast, an attempt to conquer an entire kingdom through sheer personal daring rather than overwhelming numbers. It's here that the legendary rivalry with King Ulla of Northumbria takes center stage. Ulla ruled over the region Ragnar's small force made landfall in, and where earlier Viking raids had often caught Anglo-Saxon defenders unprepared, Ulla's forces met Ragnar's undersized expedition with everything they had. The mismatch was exactly what a 2-ship raiding party against a mustered kingdom's defense would suggest. Ragnar's men were overwhelmed, and Ragnar himself was captured alive, delivered into Ulla's hands, not as a fallen enemy, but as a prisoner to be dealt with directly. What Ulla chose to do with that prisoner became the single most famous scene in Ragnar's entire legend, and it's exactly the kind of moment that needs a clear caveat attached to it. This is medieval legendary storytelling, not established historical fact. No contemporary Anglo-Saxon or Frankish chronicle records any King Ulla executing any Ragnar in this manner, and the story survives only in the much later Norse saga tradition, composed centuries after any of it could have happened. With that firmly in mind, the story itself goes like this. Ulla ordered Ragnar thrown into a pit filled with venomous snakes, a slow and deliberately humiliating execution meant to break a legendary raider down to nothing before he died. According to the saga, the snakes at first refused to bite him, held back by the special protective clothing that had once let him kill a dragon, the very garments that had given him the name Lothbrok in the first place. Only once his captors stripped that clothing away did the snakes finally reach him, and Ragnar, dying in agony, is remembered as having met his end with total defiance rather than despair. He is said to have spoken his last words with a kind of grim satisfaction, remarking on how the young pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar was suffering. a line aimed squarely at his own sons and at the vengeance he fully expected them to carry out on his behalf. What the saga tradition gives Ragnar in his last moments isn't fear. It's something closer to satisfaction. Dying slowly, venom working through him, he is remembered as facing the end the way the whole warrior culture around him said a man should, not fighting the inevitable but meeting it head-on, almost welcoming it. The crackle, the death song later poets put in his mouth, has him recounting his own life, battle by battle, even as the poison takes hold, a man cataloguing his own legend in real time rather than pleading or despairing. And running underneath all of it is Valhalla. In the world the sagas describe, a warrior's death mattered more than almost anything else about his life. And dying in this kind of drawn-out, deliberately staged execution still counted, in Ragnar's own telling, as dying like a fighting man rather than a victim. He speaks of the Valkyries already arriving to carry him off, of Odin's hall waiting to receive him, of the mead he expects to be drinking among the gods before the venom has even finished its work. Whether any real, historical man facing a real execution ever spoke anything like these words is impossible to know and, frankly, beside the point of what the story is doing. The poem isn't trying to document a death. It's trying to model one, the ideal Norse death, dignity and defiance held all the way to the final breath. And then there's the line that turns his death into a promise rather than an ending. Even as he's dying, Ragnar is remembered as thinking not of himself but of his sons, and the famous remark he leaves behind about how the young pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered works as something close to prophecy. He isn't just insulting Ulla in that moment. He's predicting, with total confidence, exactly what's coming for the man who killed him. In the logic of the saga, Ragnar dies knowing his sons will hear about this, knowing what kind of men he raised them to be, and knowing that his own death is less an ending to his story than the opening move in someone else's. It's a remarkably calculated thing to be thinking about while being killed by venomous snakes, which is exactly the point. The sagas needed Ragnar's death to function as a hinge. The moment his own legend hands itself off to his sons, and giving him a prophecy to speak in his final breath is how they built that hinge into the story itself. Word of what had happened in Northumbria didn't take long to cross back to Scandinavia, at least not in the way the sagas tell it, and the reaction from Ragnar's sons is described as immediate and total. Grief barely registers in these accounts compared to rage. The sons are portrayed less as mourning a father than as receiving a call to action they'd apparently been half expecting, since a man who lived the way Ragnar lived was always going to end up creating exactly this kind of debt for someone else to collect. Different sagas give different sons different reactions in the immediate aftermath, some more measured and calculating. Others reportedly consumed by an anger so complete it left them barely able to speak, but the underlying current running through all the versions is the same. Ulla had killed their father, and that fact alone was enough to override whatever rivalries or ambitions had previously kept the brothers pursuing separate paths. What began, in the story, as one king's execution of one aging raider became, almost immediately, the spark for something the sagas describe as vastly larger than anything Ragnar himself had ever assembled, a combined campaign built not around plunder or ambition, but around a single, shared purpose. The old boar was dead, and his sons, according to every version of this story that survives, were done merely following his example. They were about to answer for it directly. The force that landed in East Anglia in the year 865 has come to be known as the Great Heathen Army, and calling it merely a raid undersells what it actually was. This wasn't a fleet of 2 ships chasing personal glory the way Ragnar's final expedition had been. This was a genuinely large, coordinated force, drawn from across Scandinavia, arriving not to plunder and leave, but to conquer and stay. The saga tradition ties its arrival directly to Ragnar's death, framing the entire campaign as his son's answer to Ella, but historians treat that connection with real caution. What's solidly documented is the army itself and the devastation it brought. What's far less certain is whether revenge for one man's execution was truly the spark that assembled it, or whether that motive was layered on afterward by saga writers who needed a clean, satisfying reason for an invasion that likely had far more practical causes, chief among them the same hunger for land and wealth that had driven Viking activity in England for decades already. Historians continue to debate exactly who held overall command of the army and in what order, since the sources naming Ragnar's sons as its leaders come almost entirely from that same later Norse tradition, while the more contemporary Anglo-Saxon chronicles are considerably less specific about a unified leadership structure at the outset. Among the names attached to this army, one stands out for both his reputation and his mystery: Ivar the Boneless. The sagas describe him as the sharpest mind among Ragnar's sons, a strategist rather than simply a warrior, someone whose battlefield instincts and political cunning made him the most dangerous man in the entire campaign. Whatever the truth behind the vivid legendary details, and there's genuine scholarly debate about what his nickname even referred to, Ivar's role as a real historical figure is about as solid as anything connected to this whole family gets. He appears consistently across independent sources as a leading figure of the great heathen army through the late 860s, credited with the calculated, patient style of campaigning that saw the army methodically dismantle one Anglo-Saxon kingdom after another rather than simply raiding and retreating the way earlier Viking forces had. His rivalry with the Anglo-Saxon rulers standing against him reads, in the sources, less like the impulsive fury the sagas gave his brothers immediately after their father's death, and more like a genuinely strategic mind working through a long campaign with clear objectives. It's the fate of Allah specifically where legend does its most vivid work, and where the gap between story and record opens widest. According to the saga tradition, once the great heathen army had fought its way to Northumbria and captured York, Ulla was taken alive, and Ragnar's sons subjected him to an execution designed to mirror and answer their father's own death, a punishment so brutal it became known as the Blood Eagle, a ritual carving that later poetry attributes specifically to Ivar. Whether this execution ever actually happened, in any form even remotely resembling the saga's description, remains one of the most contested questions among historians of the period, with the eagle imagery appearing in slightly earlier skaldic poetry that some scholars read literally and others read as pure poetic metaphor for a straightforward death in battle. What is documented with far more confidence is simpler and, in its own way, just as consequential. Northumbria fell, its king died in the fighting for York, and the kingdom that had stood as an independent Anglo-Saxon power for centuries became the first true territorial foothold of what would soon be called the Danelaw. Whatever actually happened to Ulla personally, his defeat marked the moment a Viking army stopped raiding England and started ruling parts of it, and that shift, whatever motivated it, is the real turning point the whole Ragnar legend had been building toward. Imagine you are in a market town pulling your cloak tighter, and no one needs to ask what you do for a living. A merchant's wife passes in the other direction, and her sleeves alone announce that her household has money. Neither of them has said a word. Because in medieval Europe, clothing spoke before people did. Cloth was protection first. It kept the cold out and the sun off. And in a world without central heating, that was not a small thing. But almost as soon as it covered the body, it started doing something else. It told a story about who that body belonged to. A noblewoman's furs marked her family's land. A craftsman's leather apron marked his trade. A servant's plain wool marked her place in someone else's house. None of this needed explaining, because everyone had learnt to read it since childhood. Clothing was also, in a very literal sense, wealth worn on the body. Cloth was handmade, spun and woven and dyed by hand, and every yard of it represented real hours of real labour. A fine gown was not just pretty. It was a walking ledger of what a family could afford. This is part of why clothing differed so sharply by region and by period. A wool tunic in the Low Countries did not look like a wool tunic in Castile, and clothing at the start of the 12th century did not look like clothing at the end of the 14th. Fashion moved. It just moved slowly, and it moved differently depending on where you stood in the social order. Historians reconstruct all of this the way detectives work a scene with only partial evidence. Paintings and illuminated manuscripts preserve color and cut, though artists sometimes idealized what they painted. Archaeological digs turn up scraps of actual cloth, shoe leather, and belt fittings, giving historians the texture and weight that paintings cannot. Account books and wardrobe inventories list what real people bought and owned. Put together, these sources build a picture, incomplete but genuine, of what medieval people actually wore. And running through all of it is a stranger fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, what you wore was not simply a matter of taste. It was, in places, a matter of law. Governments wrote statutes specifying which fabrics, which furs, which colours were permitted to which rank of person. These sumptuary laws are one of the more surprising features of the medieval world, and they raise the question this series is built around. Who was actually allowed to wear what? And what happened to those who didn't listen? Imagine a single street in a medieval town on market day. A knight rides past in a well-cut wool cloak lined with fur. Behind him walks a wealthy wool merchant dressed almost as richly, and that almost is doing a great deal of work. Further along, a craftsman stands in the doorway of his workshop in a plain, hard-wearing tunic, and past him, in the mud at the edge of the road, a farm labourer wears clothing that has been patched more times than anyone could count. 5 people, 5 positions in the social order, and every one of them visible at a glance. Nobility sat at the top of this visual system, and their clothing was built to prove it. Fine wool and silk, dyed in expensive colours, trimmed in furs that had to be imported from the north. All of it announced land, title, and inherited wealth. Beneath the nobility, though, sat a group that made medieval society genuinely anxious, the merchants and wealthy townspeople. A successful cloth merchant could, by the later Middle Ages, afford garments that rivaled a minor noble's, and that similarity is exactly what unsettled the old aristocracy. Clothing was supposed to make rank legible at a glance. Merchant wealth blurred that. Artisans and craftsmen occupied a middle tier, practical but respectable. Sturdy wool, leather aprons, tools of the trade visible at the belt. Their clothing needed to survive a workday, so display mattered less than durability. Peasants and agricultural workers, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, wore the plainest and cheapest cloth available, usually undyed or dyed in whatever was locally cheap, patched and repatched until a garment had lived several lives. Servants dressed according to their household, sometimes in cast-offs from their employers, sometimes in simple livery that marked which house they belonged to. Fabric quality was the clearest signal running underneath all of this. Fine, tightly woven, richly dyed cloth cost more in labour and material than anyone outside the wealthy could hope to pay, so the weave and finish of a garment told you almost everything before you noticed the cut. It's worth separating 2 different forces at work here, though. Some of this was simple social custom. People dressed according to unwritten expectation, the same way people today dress differently for a boardroom and a farm. But in many places, authorities went further than custom. They wrote laws. And those laws, which we'll get into next, tried to make sure the visible line between classes never blurred. In 1281, a law was recorded in London requiring anyone who employed a servant to provide that servant's clothing. It sounds almost bureaucratic, but it was one of the earliest signs of something larger taking shape across medieval Europe. Governments writing formal rules about what people were allowed to wear. These are called sumptuary laws, from the Latin word for expense, and their purpose was rarely subtle. Authorities worried about excessive spending on luxury, about capital leaving the country to pay for imported silk and fur, and, perhaps most of all, about the growing difficulty of telling social classes apart just by looking at them. If a wealthy merchant's wife could dress like a baroness, the entire visual order that medieval society depended on started to crack. Sumptuary law was, in large part, an attempt to glue that order back together by decree. The laws themselves reached into remarkable detail. France restricted the burgher class from wearing gold, silver, or precious stones in public as early as the late 13th century. English legislation in the 14th century ran to more than 20 separate statutes, specifying which furs, which fabrics, and which decorations belonged to which rank. Germany's laws were fewer, but no less precise. One recorded that a noblewoman could own exactly one brooch of silver or gold, and that it could weigh no more than a single small unit called a heller. Fines and confiscation waited for anyone caught in violation, and in theory, an officer of the law could stop you in the street and judge your clothing against the statute book. In practice, though, these laws were notoriously hard to enforce. There was no police force checking hemlines door to door. Fashion moved faster than legislation could be rewritten, fines were sometimes cheaper than compliance, and a thriving second-hand clothing market let people acquire garments technically above their station. Historians studying the earliest versions of these laws, from Spain, Italy, France, and England in the 13th and 14th centuries, have noted that they were less about banning specific styles and more about limiting how much a person could visibly consume relative to their income. The goal was never really about taste. It was about keeping the social hierarchy readable, even as the people underneath it kept finding ways to make themselves harder to read. There's a surviving English statute that reads almost like a warning label. It states that anyone ranked below a knight was not to wear cloth of gold, silk, or silver, nor any embroidered clothing, nor any ring, brooch, or clasp made of gold or silver, nor any precious stones at all. Read it out loud and it sounds less like fashion advice and more like a legal fence built around an entire category of material. Silk sat right at the center of that fence. It arrived in Europe through long trade routes from the East, which alone made it expensive, and its smooth, lustrous finish couldn't be faked with local wool. Owning silk meant access to international trade networks that only the wealthy could tap into. Gold and silver worked the same way, whether woven directly into thread to make cloth of gold or shaped into brooches, clasps, and buttons. Embroidery using metallic thread pushed a plain garment into luxury territory, and precious stones, sewn directly onto fabric or set into jewelry worn with it, completed the picture of a household with serious wealth behind it. Expensive fur belonged in this same restricted category. Common furs like rabbit or cat were available further down the social scale, but the truly prized furs, sable, ermine, fine miniver, had to be imported from northern trapping networks, and their scarcity made them a natural marker for the top of society. In aristocratic households, all of these materials came together. Silk and gold brocades, fur-lined mantles, jeweled clasps, worn not simply for warmth, but as a kind of walking announcement of rank. This is exactly why authorities restricted them so specifically. It wasn't about clothing in general. It was about a defined set of materials that had become shorthand for elite status. And the more that middle-class wealth grew, the more urgently that shorthand needed protecting. A documented English example makes the stakes plain. London Museum's records preserve a law barring anyone below the rank of knight from wearing cloth of gold, silk, silver, embroidered clothing, or gold and silver jewelry set with precious stones. The line was drawn precisely at knighthood. And drawn, historians note, largely because it kept slipping. Stand two medieval townspeople side by side and, before you notice the cut of their clothes or the quality of the cloth, you'll notice the colour. Deep reds, rich purples, saturated blues. These were not casual choices. They were some of the most expensive things a person could wear, because dye, unlike thread, could not simply be spun from raw wool. It had to be extracted, often from rare plants, insects, or shellfish, in processes that were slow, difficult, and costly. Red held a particularly high place in the color hierarchy for much of the medieval period, produced from dye sources that were labor-intensive to harvest and process. Blue grew in importance as dyeing techniques using woad and, later, imported indigo improved, though achieving a truly rich, color-fast blue still took skill and expense. Black, surprisingly to modern eyes, became one of the most elite fashion colors in the later Middle Ages. A deep, even black was genuinely difficult to dye well, and by the 15th century it had become the signature color of some of the wealthiest courts in Europe. Where you lived shaped what you could dye in the first place. Local plants and available trade routes determined which colors were even possible to produce cheaply in a given region, which is part of why color fashions varied so much across Europe. And because dye cost scaled directly with color intensity and rarity, the difference between classes was visible before anyone got close enough to check the fabric. Muted, uneven, or pale tones marked ordinary wool. Deep, saturated, consistent color marked money. Some regions turn this into explicit law. The most detailed known example comes from 15th century Savoy, where the Statutes of Savoy divided the entire population into 39 ranked categories and specified, category by category, which fabrics, cuts, ornaments, and colors each rank was permitted. Under that law, the middle classes were barred from wearing red, which is part of why they gravitated instead toward the deep, elegant black that was becoming fashionable at the Burgundian court, a color the law hadn't yet thought to restrict. It's a small, telling detail. Even under one of the strictest dress codes ever written, fashion still found a color to slip through. Before a single stitch of dye or thread of gold entered the picture, every garment in medieval Europe started as raw fiber, and which fiber it was told you almost everything about the person wearing it. Wool was the backbone of European clothing, worn by nearly everyone regardless of rank, because sheep could be raised almost anywhere, and wool could be woven at every level of quality, from coarse peasant cloth to fine, tightly woven broadcloth fit for a noble's cloak. What separated a lord's wool from a labourer's wasn't the fibre itself, but the grade. How finely it was spun, how tightly it was woven, how evenly it took dye. Linen, made from flax, served as the fabric worn closest to the skin across nearly every class, valued for being cool, washable, and relatively affordable, which made it the quiet, unglamorous fabric doing the most physical work in everyday medieval life. Silk stood apart from both. It was not grown or woven locally in most of Europe for much of this period. It arrived through long trade routes originating in the east, which meant every yard carried the cost of that distance built into its price. Surviving European textiles bear this out directly. Museum collections include silk fragments dating back to the 13th century, and silk woven together with actual metal thread. Brocades from the 13th and 14th centuries, pieces so labor-intensive that only the wealthiest households could have commissioned them. Between these extremes sat a whole spectrum of imported luxury textiles, velvets, fine wool blends, patterned weaves, that entered Europe through Mediterranean and overland trade and shaped what elite fashion was even capable of looking like in a given decade. And running underneath all of it was one simple economic truth. The cost of fine fabric wasn't really about beauty. It was about the hours of human labor locked inside it, from raising the raw material to spinning, weaving, dyeing, and finishing. A medieval person looking at another person's clothing wasn't just seeing color and cut. They were, in effect, seeing that person's household budget worn openly in public. Strip away the furs, the gold thread, and the sumptuary statutes for a moment, and most medieval people, most days, were dressed in something far simpler. Layering was the foundation of medieval clothing, for warmth and for practicality, and it started right against the skin. Underneath everything came a simple linen undergarment, a shirt for men, a shift or chemise for women, worn to protect the outer clothing from sweat and to protect the skin from coarser wool. On top of that came the main garment, a tunic for men, a dress or kirtle for women, made of wool for warmth and durability, its length and fullness shifting with fashion and with the wearer's rank. A belt cinched the waist, useful for holding tools, a pouch, or a knife, and doubling as one of the few places even an ordinary person might display a bit of decoration. Below the waist, men typically wore hose, fitted leg coverings, sometimes joined, sometimes separate for each leg, tied to the tunic or to underclothes to hold them up. Over all of it, when weather demanded, came a cloak or outer mantle, simple wool for most people, fastened at the shoulder with a pin or clasp. Head coverings were nearly universal, for warmth, for modesty, and for practicality in dusty or muddy work. A simple hood or cap for men, a veil or cloth wrap for women. Shoes were leather, soft-soled, and made to be resoled and repaired rather than replaced, because new shoes, like new cloth, were never cheap. The differences between men's and women's dress were mostly a matter of the main garment's cut and length rather than a completely different wardrobe. And the differences between wealthy and working dress showed up not in which pieces someone wore, but in the fabric, the fit, and the state of repair. A peasant and a knight might, on paper, be wearing the same list of garment types: shirt, tunic, belt, hose, cloak, shoes, and yet no one on a medieval street would ever have mistaken one for the other. A medieval woman's outfit began, like everyone's, with linen, a simple undergarment worn against the skin, washable, practical, unremarkable. Everything visible and interesting happened in the layers built on top of it, and those layers were watched more closely, regulated more tightly, and judged more harshly than almost anything men wore. Over the linen came the kirtle, a fitted underdress, and over that, for those who could afford it, a fuller gown, its sleeves and neckline doing most of the work of announcing fashion and status. Sleeve shapes changed dramatically across the medieval centuries. Tight and simple in earlier periods, dramatically long or fitted with hanging cuffs later on. And necklines shifted from modest and high to more open, depending on decade, region, and rank. A belt, sometimes richly decorated among the wealthy, marked the waist. Veils and head coverings were close to universal for adult women, though how a woman covered her hair carried its own coded meaning. Married women were expected to keep their hair covered as a mark of their status, while unmarried women had somewhat more visual freedom. Elite women's fashion is where the sumptuary laws bore down hardest. Recall the restrictions naming cloth of gold, silk, embroidery, and precious stones. Many of these statutes specifically targeted what women, not men, were permitted to wear, right down to individual jewelry pieces and the number of brooches allowed. This wasn't incidental. Women's clothing was treated as a direct extension of their households, meaning their fathers or husbands. Wealth and standing, which meant it was watched as a kind of public scoreboard for the family's status and regulated accordingly. That's a large part of why women became such a frequent target of sumptuary legislation throughout medieval Europe. A man's clothing said something about him. A woman's clothing, in the eyes of the lawmakers writing these statutes, said something about her entire family, which is exactly why lawmakers felt they had the right to legislate it down to the weight of a single silver brooch. A medieval man's wardrobe looked, on its surface, simpler than a woman's. Fewer pieces, less variation in cut, but it carried just as much coded information once you knew how to read it. The tunic was the foundational garment, worn over a linen shirt, its length signaling both fashion and occupation. A working man's tunic sat higher, clear of the ankles and easy to move in, while a nobleman's could fall longer, a visible signal that its wearer didn't need to move quickly through mud and market stalls. Hose covered the legs, cut and fitted according to fashion and means, and a belt, sometimes plain leather, sometimes elaborately mounted in metal for the wealthy, carried tools, a pouch, or a blade. Cloaks and headwear completed the outfit, varying enormously in material from a working man's rough wool hood to a noble's fur-trimmed mantle and fashionable hat. One line ran clearly through men's dress that mattered less for women: the line between military and civilian clothing. A knight's identity was bound up in armor, in livery colors, in the visual language of heraldry, and that martial identity often bled into civilian fashion. Fur trim, bold color, a certain swagger of cut that marked a man as belonging to a fighting, landowning class even when he wasn't wearing a blade. Noble men's fashion pushed toward display. Fine wool, imported silk accents, fashionable sleeve and shoe shapes that changed by the decade. Merchant clothing aimed to project respectability and success without triggering the sumptuary restrictions built specifically to keep merchants a visible notch below the nobility. Working men's clothing prioritized durability above all else. Sturdy, close-fitting, easy to repair. Men's fashion changed considerably across the medieval centuries, from looser, tunic-based silhouettes in the earlier period toward more fitted, structured garments by the 14th and 15th centuries. Tighter doublets, more elaborate hose, increasingly dramatic headwear among the elite. Through all of that change, one thing stayed constant. However a man's clothing was cut, it was never neutral. It told you, before he spoke a word, whether he worked the land, fought for a lord, traded goods in a market, or owned the land others worked. Walk through a medieval town and almost no one of any age or rank goes bareheaded. Hoods, caps, veils, coifs, and hats were less an accessory than a baseline expectation, and the reasons behind that were practical, social, and religious all at once. Practically, a covered head kept out weather that mattered a great deal to people without central heating. Wind, rain, and sun all took a toll, and a simple wool hood or linen cap was one of the cheapest, most effective defenses available. For working people, head coverings also kept hair out of the way, and out of dust or grain or workshop debris, which is part of why plain hoods and caps were nearly universal among laborers and craftsmen. Modesty and religious expectation shaped things further, especially for women. Married women were generally expected to keep their hair covered in public, a custom with roots in religious teaching about modesty, and a linen coif or veil served that purpose while also, again, marking marital status at a glance. Unmarried women had somewhat more latitude, sometimes wearing their hair loose or lightly covered. For men, headwear ranged from the simple, practical hood worn by nearly everyone to the increasingly elaborate hats favored by the wealthy in the later medieval period. Tall, structured, sometimes dramatically shaped, worn less for warmth than for fashion and status. Social and regional differences ran through all of this the same way they ran through every other piece of medieval clothing. A prosperous merchant's hat, a noblewoman's fine veil, a peasant's rough wool hood, all served the same basic functions of warmth and modesty, but their material and craftsmanship instantly signaled where the wearer stood. And as the medieval period wore on, especially into its final centuries, headwear among the elite grew steadily more elaborate, more sculptural, more expensive. Hats and headdresses becoming, alongside sleeves and color, one of the clearest fashion statements a wealthy medieval person could make. Even the head, it turns out, was never just covered for warmth. It was covered to be read.